For 54 years, one family ruled Syria through industrial terror and systematic mass murder, building a regime so brutal it came to be known as the world's largest torture state. From Hafez al-Assad's 1970 coup and the massacre of 40,000 in Hama, to Bashar's era of chemical weapons and secret prisons where 13,000 were hanged and erased, the Assad Dynasty turned an entire nation into a testing ground for state-sponsored horror. Hospitals, schools, even food supplies became targets of calculated violence. How could a regime orchestrate crimes so savage they're almost hard to stomach and conceal them for generations? To answer, you have to go back to where this dynasty of oppression began. Hafez al-Assad took power in a bloodless coup on November 13, 1970, stepping into the presidential palace as the new master of Syria. He was a career military officer, a Ba'ath Party loyalist, and a man who trusted almost no one. Within months, he began building a security architecture unlike anything the country had seen. More than 100 security agencies, known as the Mukhabarat, spread across Syria, each with its own secret prisons, informant networks, and power to detain without trial. At the top, Hafez ruled through a tight circle of family and trusted Alawite officers, keeping rivals in constant fear of arrest or worse. By the late 1970s, the machinery of repression was running at full speed. Dissidents disappeared into places like Tadmor and Meze prisons, where torture was routine and few returned alive. Political parties, unions, and even student groups were infiltrated or dissolved.
متعبة كتير إنه تعتقل مع شخص بيعني لك كتير يعني. ما بحسن يعني إنه يكون شادي عم يتعذب وأنا عم بسمع صوت العذاب.
The Mukhabarat kept files on millions of Syrians, tracking the smallest hint of disloyalty. Hafez's regime relied on collective punishment. If one person was suspected, entire families could be targeted. Whispers of resistance were met with midnight raids, and the knock on the door became a symbol of terror. In February 1982, the city of Hama became the site of the most notorious massacre in modern Syrian history. After an Islamist uprising, Hafez ordered his brother Rifat and elite units to crush the revolt. Over the course of 3 weeks, artillery and tanks leveled entire neighborhoods. Estimates of the dead range from 20,000 to 40,000 civilians, men, women, and children buried beneath the rubble. The message was clear. Any challenge to Assad rule would be answered with overwhelming force. By the end of the 1980s, Syria was a country ruled by fear. The Mukhabarat operated openly, their black Volga cars a warning on every street. The regime's security chiefs, Ali Duba, Mohammed al-Kuli, and others, became household names, synonymous with torture and disappearance. Entire generations grew up learning to speak in whispers, to trust no one, and to expect surveillance everywhere, even at home. When Hafez's eldest son Basil died in a car crash in 1994, the succession plan changed overnight. Bashar, an unassuming London-trained ophthalmologist, was summoned home and pushed into the heart of the regime. Hafez ordered his new heir to study the security files, attend high-level Ba'ath meetings, and train with the Republican Guard. Internal party memos and later testimony from defectors describe a crash course in dictatorship. Bashar was told to modernize the surveillance system, streamline the bureaucracy of repression, and centralize records of torture and execution. By the time Hafez died in 2000, the foundation for a dynasty of industrial-scale terror was complete. The son would inherit not just power, but a blueprint for systematic oppression. By the early 2000s, Syria's arsenal was no longer limited to bullets and bombs. Deep inside military compounds, engineers and officers expanded a secret chemical weapons program, stockpiling nerve agents and choking gases in defiance of international law. The regime built clandestine production lines at sites like the Barzeh Scientific Research Center and the Masyaf facility, using front companies to import banned precursors and equipment. Western intelligence tracked shipments of methylphosphoryl difluoride, a key ingredient for sarin, routed through shadowy brokers in Russia and North Korea. By 2011, Syria's chemical stockpile was among the largest outside the major powers, with hundreds of tons of sarin, VX, and mustard gas stored in bunkers near Homs, Aleppo, and Damascus. The regime's doctrine was clear. Chemical weapons were to be used as tools of terror, not just against enemy soldiers, but against entire communities suspected of opposition. Delivery systems ranged from modified aerial bombs to homemade barrel bombs, often dropped from helicopters onto crowded neighborhoods. The first major reports of chemical attacks surfaced in late 2012, when medics in Homs and Idlib described victims gasping for air, their pupils pinpricked, bodies convulsing in the streets. Over the next year, the pattern repeated. Chlorine cylinders rolled into basements, rockets filled with nerve agents fired into rebel-held suburbs, entire families poisoned in their sleep. On August 21, 2013, the regime crossed every line. In the pre-dawn hours, artillery units loyal to the Republican Guard launched a barrage of rockets loaded with sarin gas into the Ghouta district east of Damascus. Within minutes, the air filled with a sweet, sickly odor. Hospital workers, many of them volunteers, tried to resuscitate children who arrived lifeless and foaming at the mouth. By sunrise, more than 1,000 civilians lay dead, most of them women and children. The attack left entire blocks silent, except for the sound of rescue workers washing bodies with garden hoses, desperate to remove the invisible poison. International investigators arrived days later. The UN, United Nations, and OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, collected soil samples, interviewed survivors, and traced the munitions trajectories back to regime artillery positions. Laboratory analysis confirmed high-purity sarin, matching stocks previously cataloged by Western intelligence. Intercepted communications and defectors' testimony linked the operation directly to command orders from the highest levels of the Syrian military. The Ghouta massacre became the deadliest chemical attack of the 21st century, drawing condemnation from every major government and human rights body. Yet Ghouta was only one chapter. Over 300 chemical attacks have been documented since, with at least 1,514 Syrians killed and more than 11,000 injured by banned agents. The regime's chemical campaign targeted not just fighters, but hospitals, schools, and civilian shelters, deliberately inflicting terror on those with nowhere left to run. International teams continue to gather evidence, preserving samples and testimony for future trials. As one OPCW investigator later put it, the Assad regime's use of poison gas stands as the largest documented campaign of chemical mass murder since World War I. Inside Saydnaya prison, the machinery of death operated with chilling precision. Twice a week, guards would rouse prisoners in the dead of night, reading out names from a list. Those called were blindfolded, hands tied behind their backs, and marched down echoing corridors to the basement. There, executioners waited beside metal pipes rigged as gallows. The routine never changed. No last words, no appeals. Bodies dropped through trapdoors, left hanging until guards returned at dawn. Over 5 years, more than 13,000 men and boys were hanged in these chambers. Each morning, the corpses were loaded onto trucks and driven to military crematoria or mass graves, their identities erased by false death certificates listing invented causes like respiratory failure. A former guard later described the process. "We numbered the bodies before burning them. Every week, the same routine: execution, documentation, cremation. The evidence was meant to vanish, but fragments survived." A military photographer, codenamed Caesar, smuggled out tens of thousands of images, emaciated bodies, faces frozen in agony, each tagged and cataloged by prison staff. These photographs, now archived by international investigators, expose the scale and method of industrialized killing. But hanging was only one facet of Saydnaya's cruelty. Survivors who made it out alive described torture that went far beyond beatings and starvation. Sexual violence was a constant threat, wielded as a weapon to shatter resistance and punish entire families. UN investigators gathered hundreds of testimonies from men and women who endured rape, forced nudity, and sexual humiliation at the hands of guards. The regime's security branches documented these abuses with photographs and video, not just to break prisoners, but to blackmail them and their relatives after release. One survivor, now a witness in a European court, recalled, "They filmed everything, not just to break us, but to blackmail us forever." Inside Syednaya, the line between punishment and extermination disappeared. Prisoners were starved, denied medicine, and left in cells so crowded that sleep meant standing upright. Some died from torture, others from neglect. The salt rooms on the first floor stored bodies when mass graves filled up or roads were blocked. Even in death, the regime exerted control. Families received no word, only silence or a forged document. For years, the world glimpsed these horrors through satellite images and whispered survivor accounts. Now, with Saydnaya's survivors guiding forensic teams through the ruins, the full record of mechanized cruelty is coming into focus. In the years after 2011, no place in Syria was safe. Not hospitals, not schools, not the family home. The regime's air force and artillery mapped out opposition-held neighborhoods, marking every clinic and ambulance station for destruction. Over 600 medical facilities were bombed, many more than once. Barrel bombs, oil drums packed with explosives and scrap metal, fell from helicopters onto emergency rooms, crowded with children. Cluster munitions burst above playgrounds and markets, scattering death across the pavement. Rescue workers, known as the White Helmets, became the last hope for survivors trapped beneath collapsed roofs. One medic, who lost his brother in a double-tap strike, described how the bombs always returned. First, the initial explosion would tear through a hospital or school. Minutes later, as volunteers rushed in to pull out the wounded, a second wave of bombs would target the rescuers themselves. This tactic, known as the double tap, was recorded hundreds of times in regime targeting logs, later recovered from security branch archives. The aim was clear: to turn every act of rescue into a potential death sentence, to ensure that even the helpers would fear to come. Entire families vanished overnight. More than 100,000 people disappeared into the regime's detention network. Their names entered into coded intake logs, but never released. Parents searched for years, sending letters to the Red Crescent, bribing officials, clinging to rumors of survival. A mother from Daraya recounted the last time she saw her teenage son, pulled from a checkpoint line, blindfolded, and never heard from again. Her story repeats across Syria. Families waiting by silent phones, hoping for a message that never comes. Security branches maintained meticulous records, cross-referencing arrest lists with execution orders and disappearance files. After the regime's collapse, forensic teams found entire rooms stacked with registers, names, dates, coded charges, evidence of a system designed to erase lives with bureaucratic precision. Each entry represents a person who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only grieving relatives and a line in an official ledger. For years, survivors and aid workers gathered fragments of evidence: shrapnel from hospital wards, photographs of bombed ambulances, intake lists smuggled out by defectors. Now, these records are being cataloged for international trials, giving voice to the victims and documenting the scale of the regime's assault on civilian life. The attack on hospitals and the machinery of disappearance were not accidents of war. They were policy, calculated, systematic, and relentless. In Syria, the simple act of seeking medical care or searching for a loved one became an act of courage, shadowed by the constant threat of obliteration. Syria's war machine ran on more than fear and firepower. It was fueled by a criminal empire exporting billions in synthetic drugs. By the early 2020s, Captagon, an amphetamine pill stamped with 2 crescent moons, became Syria's most valuable export, eclipsing oil, textiles, and agriculture. The trade generated over $10 billion a year, dwarfing the country's legal economy and underwriting the regime's intelligence operations and military campaigns. At the center stood Maher al-Assad, commander of the 4th Armored Division, and his cousin Samer, who controlled key production and smuggling hubs near Latakia. Their network ran industrial-scale pill factories, guarded by soldiers and shielded by military intelligence. Shipments left Syrian ports hidden in machinery, citrus crates, and shipping containers bound for Europe, the Gulf, and North Africa. In 2020, Italian customs seized 14 tons of Captagon, worth €1 billion, inside paper rolls at Salerno, the largest European drug bust linked to Syria. Across the continent, Europol tracked seizures totaling over €500 million, each trail leading back to regime-controlled warehouses and front companies. Profits flowed through a web of shell companies in Lebanon and the UAE, laundered by regime insiders and Hezbollah operatives. Financial records, intercepted by European law enforcement, revealed profit-sharing agreements. Maher's division claimed the largest share. Samer's syndicate managed logistics, and Hezbollah secured transit routes. The regime used these billions to pay loyalists, fund militias, and buy influence abroad, while ordinary Syrians starved under sanctions and siege. Assad's drug empire was not a side business. It was the profit engine that sustained systematic violence, regional terror, and the machinery of mass repression. On December 12, 2024, the gates of Saydnaya prison were forced open for the first time in over a decade. At dawn, Free Syrian army units and defected military police breached the northeast service entrance and the western wall, pushing through barricades with commandeered regime vehicles. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of burned flesh. Crematoria in the lower courtyards were still warm, their fires hastily doused. Survivors emerged, gaunt and blinking in the sunlight, some carried out on stretchers, others barely able to walk. Forensic teams led by UN-mandated specialists and accompanied by European prosecutors entered within hours. In the basement, they found execution chambers intact, ropes still hanging from metal pipes, and piles of clothing stripped from the condemned. Digital archives, hastily abandoned by fleeing staff, lined the administration offices. Intake logs, execution orders, and thousands of ID photographs. Outside Damascus, mass graves at al-Qutaifa were exhumed under international supervision. DNA labs set up in temporary tents processed remains, matching names from Saydnaya's registers to families who had waited years for answers. Survivors, some missing for over a decade, guided investigators through torture rooms and salt storage chambers, pointing out where cellmates had died and where bodies were stored during road closures. In Berlin, Paris, and The Hague, prosecutors filed new indictments within days, using the recovered archives as primary evidence. Universal jurisdiction cases expanded overnight, with warrants issued for regime officials now hiding in Russia and Lebanon. For the first time, the machinery of terror was exposed in real time. Its survivors standing in the ruins, their testimony backed by a paper trail of orders and photographs. Decades of silence ended with the clang of opening gates and the first public reading of the names of the dead. Over 100,000 Syrians disappeared and more than 13,000 prisoners were executed in Saydnaya alone. Just two numbers from a regime that ruled by systematic terror for 54 years. International investigators have now entered the prisons, uncovering mass graves, execution logs, and thousands of classified documents. Yet, much remains hidden. The full fate of the disappeared, the identities of all perpetrators, and the extent of secret chemical stockpiles are still unknown. The fall of the Assad regime in December 2024 exposed industrial-scale crimes, from chemical attacks on civilians to the $10 billion Captagon drug empire fueling war. European courts have opened cases against top officials, and survivors are finally free to testify. With every file unsealed and every witness heard, the evidence grows. The record is clear. Systematic state violence, mass murder, and economic exploitation defined the Assad Dynasty. Justice, though incomplete, has begun, and the facts can no longer be denied.